Welcome back. It's good to have you here, and I know it's getting on in the afternoon, and I'm delighted that you're still hanging in with us because I think we have an exciting follow-up to, well, not only to Christine's first lecture this morning, but to all the things that have happened since. It's amazing to me how you get all this list of different speakers, and everything seems to dovetail together in important synergies. So. Thanks for being a part of this, Christine. I don't think anybody's going to introduce you a second time. We heard all about that the first time around, and so I'm just going to get out of the way and let you jump right into it.
Okay, thanks, Stephen. How's everybody doing? Are you hanging in there okay? Yeah, good for you. Good. Well, the title of this lecture is called "The Future is Here. It's Just on the Margins." And in the lecture this morning, we talked about the ways in which God is at work in our world, actively transforming the communities in which we live. The pandemic has made apparent what has been happening for some time, that many of our social systems and structures that have shaped our communities for several hundred years no longer function well. They no longer give life as they were intended to, and they don't serve the people they were created to serve. They no longer elicit people's energies and commitment. Indeed, many are badly broken or collapsing. And I also said that, however, in our story, our tradition tells us that in the midst of that disruption and that unraveling, God is also at work, creatively regenerating our communities, creating new ways of living together in community. God is making a new Genesis in our midst, and local churches get to join in that regeneration. This afternoon, I want us to consider that in the midst of regenerating our communities, our neighborhoods, God is also transforming the church. The kinds of churches that served us well in Christendom are often struggling even to survive in a rapidly changing context. If we are to be midwives for God's new creation, we need different forms of church than what we currently have. We don't always perceive the new work that God is doing among us. We don't recognize God's new life because it doesn't always look like the ways of living and functioning that we are used to. More than that, God's transformative work often happens quietly in out-of-the-way places, and we are looking elsewhere. For 4 years, I worked with EDGE Network for Ministry Development, and part of my responsibilities included animating new ministry development in rural and small-town churches. I wasn't in the position for very long before I began to realize that in many instances, new ministry in rural and small-town churches wasn't going to look like new ministry in city and suburban and larger churches. Most of the churches weren't going to be starting new programs, and they weren't going to be planting new faith communities in their little villages and hamlets. Very often, as well, applying new church development methods and models in rural areas did not work in their context. Even implementing church renewal and church growth techniques did not generally have the results that the congregations had hoped for, or the changes did not last beyond the ordered minister's time with that congregation. A few congregations could make the programs work for them. That's certainly the case, but most could not. Some congregations were never going to grow in numbers, no matter how vigorously or faithfully they applied whatever strategies were currently popular. It was apparent that a different dynamic was at work in those locations. At first, I thought that meant that a different approach was needed, one that was appropriate to the rural context. Except there were not a lot of alternative approaches specifically designed for rural churches. At least, I wasn't finding them. Somewhere along the road, I came across a quote that changed my search. I don't know where I read it first, but it arrived as a signpost directing me in a new direction. The future is here. It's just on the margins. I realized that I'd been looking in the wrong places and for the wrong things. I'd been looking to find out what rural congregations could be doing that would lead them to grow and to thrive. What actions were growing rural churches taking that were working? What strategies were reversing the declines in numbers and finances and workers that were causing so many congregations such great anxiety? I finally clued in that I needed to be asking different questions. I realized that the critical thing to pay attention to is not what congregations needed to do in order to find their way into a viable future. The critical thing to pay attention to is what God is already doing to create a new future in their midst. To use this morning's metaphor, I realized that the story I was living in was an Isaiah 43 story. I am God, your Holy One, the Creator of Israel, your Redeemer. Be alert, be present. I'm about to do something brand new. It is bursting out, don't you see it? There it is. I'm making a road through the desert, rivers in the Badlands. I found myself expending less energy on trying to fix what was wrong with churches, and I began giving more attention on helping congregations discern and join what God was already doing in their midst. If God is right now creating a new future, if that new future is already here, then what does it look like? Where were roads appearing in the desert? Where were rivers watering the Badlands? And how do we navigate that new land? What does it look like to live into God's mission of creating new ways of being in community together? To my delight and surprise, I began finding the answers to those questions in small, rural, often remote congregations all across the country, all across the denomination, but on the margins. It was as if they had been venturing into God's new future long before the larger churches in urban and suburban places were even aware that they were going to need to do so. This morning, I talked about being aware of the kind of story we are in, the script that we live by. Our scriptures describe the story of God's relationship with the people of Israel and with the early church. And it's a complex and diverse story. Some parts of it come to the forefront more prominently at certain times than at others. So this afternoon, I invite you to consider that the part of the story that we are in is the section where the people of Israel have been wandering in the wilderness for several years. They arrive at the border of the land of Canaan, and God tells Moses to send 12 men ahead into the new territory to scout out the land ahead of them. So Moses chooses the 12, one from each tribe, and then he says to them, "Look the land over, see what it is like. Assess the people. Are they strong or weak? Are there few or many? Observe the land. Is it pleasant or harsh? Describe the towns where they live. Are they open camps or fortified with walls? And the soil, is it fertile or barren? Are there forests? And try to bring back a sample of the produce that grows there. This is, after all, the season of the first ripe grapes." Well, that's what the scouts did, and they came back with their report and some grapes, their report about the land that lay before the people. As we emerge from the pandemic, we find ourselves at the border of a different world than the one we were in when we went into the pandemic. And there are among us those who have already been into that world ahead of us. Many congregations are now facing some of the same challenges that small, rural, and remote congregations have been wrestling with for years. In those years, they have figured out some things about what it takes to live in that new world. I want to mention just 3 of those challenges, and we'll hear from a couple of congregations that have been figuring out how to meet them. First of all, many congregations are coming out of the pandemic, realizing that many of their people are not going to come back. The number of people participating in Sunday worship sometimes has decreased significantly. The finances that were already stressed before the pandemic are now at a stage of crisis. The income from fundraisers and building rentals has diminished or disappeared altogether. People are even more weary and anxious than they were before they had to endure a long period of isolation. In short, many congregations that considered themselves large congregations or medium-sized congregations now realize that they are small congregations. And small congregations have very different dynamics than large congregations. Those congregations that have been small, and many rural churches are, those congregations that have been small for many years have wisdom to share about what that looks like. We've been living in a bigger is better world, and that attitude is prevalent even among the church. A small church is often considered to be less than a large church. I've served a small congregation who were told by 2 previous ministers that they were too small to be a church. They were pressured to close and to amalgamate with a larger church in a nearby town. Some members eventually did just that, and it got ugly in the process. The people that stayed behind were vilified and told that they were standing in the way of progress. By the time I arrived to help to serve them, they were demoralized and barely holding on. They were surprised when I told them that most of the first Christian churches were no larger than they were. For the first 300 years of Christianity, most Christian churches were house churches, small enough that they could meet in people's homes. And those small churches, often hanging on by their fingertips on the edge of the Roman Empire, had within 300 years transformed the entire culture. I told them, being small does not disqualify you from being the church, even though you might look bad on the statistics forms, even if you leave lots of blanks in your church life profile because you aren't doing the kinds of things that that form asks about. The critical question, I would say, is not what size you are or how many people you have in worship or how many programs you run. The critical question you need to answer is, does God still want you to be a witness to the gospel in this location? If your answer to that question is no, then we need to find a way for you to close and to move on. If, on the other hand, your answer to that question is yes, then we need to figure out how you can be that witness faithfully, creatively, courageously. We need to learn to trust that the Holy Spirit will provide the people we need to do the work that God has given us to do. Well, there are congregations that have learned that God can do amazing things with small groups and people. They are living evidence that Jesus was telling the truth when he said that the kingdom of heaven operates like yeast, like salt, like a mustard seed, small in size, but powerful in impact. One of those congregations is St. John's United Church in Marathon, Ontario. It didn't used to be a small church. It used to be a middle-sized congregation. But then the major employer in town shut down, and St. John's had to figure out what it meant to be the church in a very different way. George Bott is a member of St. John's, and I'm going to invite you to listen to him reflect on the journey and what they've learned along that journey at St. John's in Marathon.
It's hard to really understand at what point we became who we are today as a church, with the core ministry of radical and intentional hospitality. To really understand how we came there, we need to look back at from where we came. What are our roots? From its outset, this was a busy, active ministry. The congregational numbers started out in 1962, somewhere around 100 to 150 on a Sunday, perhaps more. As I recall, they weren't so community-oriented in the early days, but we were a new faith community, and we're just beginning to learn who we were in the bigger picture. I suppose the greatest change to shape St. John's faith community was when Reverend David Giuliano arrived on our doorstep, fresh from his internship in a small Saskatchewan community, to begin his first full-time ministry, his first pastoral charge. As it turns out, he was with us for over 30 years. I think it was at this point which St. John's began the journey to become radically and intentionally hospitable. Just prior to David Giuliano's arrival in Marathon, several events within the broader community were responded to by this faith community. For example, there was a small contingent of the Salvation Army located in Marathon. As part of their service to this community, they organized and ran a small thrift store and a food bank. At that time, there was very little need for a food bank, and the thrift store was really insufficiently organized and for the most part was underutilized. St. John's United Church took over the operation of the thrift store and food bank following the Salvation Army's departure from town. Over a number of years, change was made in the operation of both the thrift store and the food bank, to the point where the store made sufficient money annually to supply all of the needs for the food bank and for the Christmas hamper program. So the food bank and the thrift store are now incorporated as their own nonprofit with its own board of directors, some of whom are members of St. John's Community of Faith. And they now have a community garden that exists on the front lawn of St. John's United Church. Around the time that David Giuliano returned to Marathon from his time as moderator of the United Church, our numbers had changed and dropped sufficiently that we were becoming a small church. We discovered that it was very difficult to do all of the things that we had once done with fewer people to help share the load. David took time to do some study and reflection prior to returning home on the characteristics of small church. So we spent some time in discernment to discover what it is that we can do, even though our numbers are fewer. When we looked at the kinds of things that we did within the community and the community of faith, much of it had to do with hospitality. We were always finding ways to connect with one another in our faith community and with the people who live within the broader community of Marathon. We spent much time welcoming the stranger into our midst. For approximately 20 years, we produced dinner theaters, 2 to 3 a year. Our largest and target audience was the whole of our community, and the plays we wrote looked at the things within our town that were causing people to be upset and angry, to grumble, or to be concerned about. The intent of the play was to highlight those things that were upsetting us and to bring them to the forefront and to poke fun at them and make people laugh about how silly all of this anger was. In doing this, we provided them not only with some entertainment, but a meal unlike any meal that they would find in any of the restaurants within this town. It was through our dinner theaters that we connected with people from all faith communities, all walks of life, and had them participate with us in many of the projects that we took on. It mattered not that they were members of our church, our faith community. Hospitality. The results of our discernment about being a small church was that we just couldn't do everything that we once did. So we chose to do what we did best. We focused on hospitality, and we named it radical and intentional hospitality. It was radical because it took us back to our roots as Christians. Our focus was on Jesus. It was intentional because we were about looking for ways in which we could be hospitable to everyone living within the town and the stranger. We began to measure everything from that one core ministry that we defined for ourselves. How would Jesus have done this? What would Jesus have done, expected, directed? We freed ourselves of most of the committee structures. There weren't enough people to take on the roles of the committees. That was a reality. When the major employer in the town pulled up stakes and left, the town was in shock, and many people were in need emotionally, spiritually, and financially. Retirees of that company lost about 40% of their pension. Employees of the mill that had not continued upgrading or taking training opportunities that were available in the mill during their years of employment found themselves no longer candidates to be hired by other companies because they didn't have sufficient education. Our community of faith went into action with radical and intentional hospitality to everyone who needed it for 4 years, maybe a little bit longer. Every Friday night, we held a potluck dinner for everybody in the town who chose to come. If you had something to bring and share, great, but it was not a requirement. It provided opportunity for us to listen to the stories and hear the anxieties and offer prayer if requested and a listening ear for those who needed it. We took care of children so moms and dads could have some time with other adults who were in the same boat they were. We read stories and we did craft and we played games and we ate together. We set up a bank of computers and provided helpers to assist those that were technologically challenged to make all the contacts they needed with banks and government agencies and help them fill out the myriad of forms that needed to be filled. Members of our community of faith worked with the municipal office to provide educational support for people who wanted to get their GED and graduate from grade 12. And every Friday night, we sat down at a meal together and told stories and played games. We listened and let everyone know that they were not alone. Some of us took people without the financial means to medical appointments in out of town and other communities. Groups traveling through the region found shelter and warmth and food with us. The people of Grassy Narrows often stay with us each year as they travel to and from Toronto, seeking government attention to the plight of their water polluted by mercury. We are committed to other issues as well that fit within our core ministry, at least from our perspective. We are all aware of climate change issues and are conscious of our carbon footprint. At a time when the Ontario government was offering an energy project called Microfit, St. John's bought into it and mounted a 10 megawatt solar system on our church roof. People in town often watch to see what we're up to. And as a result of our move to solar, many homes in this town now have solar systems on their homes. The municipality has installed several arrays on their own buildings. We began a composting program within our community of faith, in part to reduce landfill waste and to recycle for the gardens. Some of us invested in indoor composters and did workshops within the larger community to show off our discovery of an inexpensive way to enrich our gardens. Eventually, we interested the municipal government in what we were doing and convinced the town to invest in the composters. So they put in $10,000 into the project and bought a load of the units we recommended, and then gave them away to the folks in town to create compost for their gardens. Smart move. It significantly reduced the amount of waste going to landfill each week. I'm certain I could go on and talk about many more examples of how we have changed our ministry and our mission, but suffice to say that everything we do as a faith community is viewed through the lens of our core ministry, radical and intentional hospitality. As we move forward, our hope is that those who join us will find this a Christ-filled ministry, a discipleship with incredible joy as the result.
Thanks, Stephen. I don't know if things were, the audio was as muffled for other people as it was for me. Did people find that? No, they found it okay? Okay, because when I was working with it, it was fine. But anyway, the wonders of technology. So I want to take a few minutes then together and great, thanks, Ryan. And in the chat box, if you can put in what you noticed about that journey that St. John's United has taken to be a small church that is participating, joining God in the regeneration of community. Anything that you noticed that stood out for you, or
faithful intentionality in embracing that change as opportunities rather than failure, says Reed. And Bruce says, clear understanding of mission, focus on what they can do next, says Sundo. Clear vision that changes as the community needs change. So they became a leader of the town. Strong, small, strong, says Pam. They don't discount themselves and looked at how they could be influential leaders in the community. Less focus on institutional tasks, says Aaron, more of a community orientation. Appreciated that they took the lead in composting and invited others to follow, says Irene. Plugged into the community, says Kevin. Community focus, adds Walter. It evolves, says Beth. They have a core ministry, but the specifics change as they respond to opportunities and challenges in their community and the world. Intentionality and faithfully establishing a core mission and call, simplifying the structure led to a widening of community, says Ryan. Building relationships with all kinds of people with needs, says Laurie. Seems to begin by watching to see what God was doing, says Eric, which they could join in and support and encourage. Not losing hope in the face of adversity. Choosing to participate in things they could do well, not worry about things they used to be able to do well. Very welcoming. Size didn't hamper them to continue to be witnesses in the community. The work of the church was extended beyond the walls. Radical hospitality was the focus. Wonderful approach for rural ministry. However, as a half-time minister in 5 congregations, I'm struggling to figure out how to adapt such ideas for all of my locations without total burnout on my part. And Laurie adds, it sounds like all the church members were involved. It wasn't just reliant on the leadership of the minister. So focused leadership, pastoral care with vision and active discipleship. Clearly using the gifts of a talented group of church members. Wow, says Reed. George didn't say this, says Beth, but knowing George and Joy, you can see how this grows out of the spiritual gifts that they have and likely were shared by others in the community.
Thanks, Stephen. And I think that that's a significant learning from that example, from that story, is that this is not about what the minister was able to accomplish. And that's one thing that small churches certainly have to learn and well, certainly learn, because they very seldom can afford full-time ordered ministry. And so if the church is going to happen, it happens because the lay people take up their ministries. And so I certainly feel for you, Connie, in terms of you've got 5 congregations, and I would say that the only way you can do that work is by understanding that your task is not to do the ministry, but to set the congregation members free to do whatever ministry they feel they're called to do, and to and whatever kind of community they need to be, and resist that pressure, if there is pressure, to have you do it all. It just can't be done. And small congregations that are thriving have learned that. I don't know if you noticed, but George is Richard Bott's father, if you knew that. And so they have had David Giuliano as their minister, and then Richard was born and raised in Marathon. So they're thinking that they might put a sign out at the front of the town, at the entrance to the town, saying, if you want to be moderator of the United Church of Canada, come join us. But yes, so it's significant how much they accomplish. And as we've picked up, it was that they said, we can't do everything. And they say it right on their website. They say, as a small church, we can't do everything. We can do the one thing we're called to be and to do. And that is, and they just spent about several months discerning that was radical inclusive hospitality. And they just go for it. What I like about that story is that it tells me that being small is not the problem. When a congregation becomes small in number, and if it discerns that the Holy Spirit is still at work in its midst, it certainly needs to figure out how it can afford to be a small church. Usually that means figuring out what to do about paid ministry staffing, and sometimes about the building, because those are usually their largest expenses. Although in rural churches, very often the building is a minimal expense. It's really not that expensive to keep it going. As George mentioned in the video, the small church needs to change its governance structure so that those structures are appropriate to the people and the mission that it is doing. It will need to develop partnerships outside of the congregation. Did you notice how often it was that the church wasn't doing something on its own? It was in partnership with other groups, other organizations. And he says their approach is, if they start something and they do it, they'll do it in partnership with somebody. And as soon as the thing has feet under it, they give it away and let other people take charge of it and keep it going. So they don't have any need to be the ones doing it all. The church needs to trust that it is not on its own, that it is part of the body of Christ. It doesn't have to do everything. It needs to focus on doing the one thing that God is gifting it to do. And that's different from the churches I've known in the city. The city churches have tended to be churches that offer a one-stop shop, everything from womb to tomb, and programs for everybody in between. And that's just not sustainable anymore. So if small churches need to focus on the one thing that God is gifting them to do. Being small, then, is not the problem. In fact, it can be an advantage. In many places in our culture, the dominance of large, consolidated, centralized organizations is declining. People are realizing that bigger isn't always better. Being small can mean that you are more nimble, more able to respond to rapidly changing conditions. Small can be a better space for human connection and human growth. In fact, we are living in a time when many people are embracing micro communities where they know they belong, where they are able to participate actively, where they make a difference. If God is regenerating our culture, our society, then it seems to me that we need more small local congregations, not fewer. Somebody has even said that the Christian church needs to be small because the church is meant to spread everywhere. And you cannot plant and sustain mega churches everywhere. They require more infrastructure and more resources than most locations have available. But you can form small groups of people whom the Holy Spirit is calling together to be a witness to the gospel. Of course, if the Spirit has placed you in a medium to large-sized congregation at this point, you'll just need to do what you can with what you've been given. I'm just saying that what we perhaps need to rethink our enchantment with large-sized churches. And I also think we should not be closing churches that still have a part to play in God's healing and reconciling mission. We should be finding ways that they can be where they are and be a witness to the gospel of Jesus, who seemed to enjoy small things a lot. I want to pause just for a moment and see if anybody has anything they want to add then to the conversation about the pathway to regeneration may be to embrace the smallness of our congregations and not see it as a problem.
Reed's put up a quote from Margaret Mead: "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world."
And that's right, they have throughout history.
It's the only thing that has, says Ryan.
Anybody else want to respond to anything I've said?
I'm always struck by how much church work relies on relationship.
Well,
And
then that's what we're going to talk about. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say it relies on the peculiarities and the uniqueness of the individuals in the relationship. And I'm not sure you can have those kinds of relationships in a really big setting. That's why in mega churches, they require everybody to be part of house groups.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, I think the relationships is the other area that is part of the focus for pathways to regeneration of our communities and of our churches. People are emerging from the pandemic after a long period of social isolation. Families and neighborhoods and whole communities have fractured under the stress. That fragmentation has been an element of our lives long before the pandemic happened. But even before the pandemic, we were socializing less. We were disconnected from each other more. Robert Putnam highlighted that in a book called Bowling Alone. He said more people are bowling, but they're not bowling in teams. They go and just bowl by themselves. It's kind of a canary in the mine kind of symbol. Our lives, our communities have been fragmented, and in the past few years, that isolation and loneliness, which many people have said was at huge levels before the pandemic, but now has been accelerated even more. That loneliness, isolation, sense of fragmentation shows up in the violence and the brutality that fills our news feeds. So God's work of regenerating our communities is going to entail rebuilding relationships with each other. It will involve embracing practices that bridge the divides that separate us and taking down barriers that keep us apart. It will involve learning how to live in community with people who are different from us, who hold radically different views and convictions from our own, who we may even experience as being strangers and aliens in our land. As Walter Brueggemann reminds us, the church's story is about living into God's plan of covenantal neighborliness. We turn from our preoccupation with ourselves towards the God of the covenant. And that God liberates us to take the bold and courageous and creative action we need to cultivate communities of care and generosity with our neighbors. That's how our communities, how we grow communities where human beings can flourish. Many churches, especially larger churches, are shaped around offering programs to which they hope people will come. That's just the nature of larger churches. When they search for ways to grow or even to remain viable into the future, they often look for a new program or a new project that will bring people into the church. In the post-COVID world, relationships are going to need to take precedence over programs and projects. Even if those congregations are able to sustain a model of church which is shaped by programs and projects, those programs will need to be considered to be vehicles and vessels for cultivating life-giving relationships between people. If you're going to transform a culture, you will need to work at the level of deep relationships. As someone once said, change happens at the pace of trust, and trust happens at the pace of relationships. Rural churches tend to be oriented more around relationships than programs, and I think Stephen was saying that small churches are in the same way. Even when they engage in projects or when they run programs, the driving force in rural churches is relationship. Somebody said rural life and living is designed to be an experience centered in shared community. Rural life demands that you live in association with others, that you look out for each other's interests. So rural churches are usually small enough to be the right size for relationships, where people feel that they can be vulnerable with one another, where they can trust each other enough that deep connections get formed. One woman said, I find I can be honest about who I am here. Well, actually, the truth is I can't pretend to be something I'm not because people know me too well. I couldn't get away with it. People in rural churches have lived into the complexity and the challenges and difficulty of being in community with people you do not necessarily like. As someone said, in a rural community, it's harder not to show up when even if there is somebody that you don't get along with. You got to go to the committee meeting anyway, even if you know you're going to run into someone you don't like. The community is small enough and often stable enough that the people are connected to each other, not just by their church connections, but through family relationships, by participating in different groups together, by being at common social events. Their close relationships can span multiple generations. You're going to meet each other not just on Sunday morning or at midweek Bible study or at the board meetings. You'll meet them also in the local coffee shop and at your cousin's wedding and at the community fair. Now, granted, this can be both a blessing and a curse. Rural churches don't always do relationships well. Rural churches are not always beacons of faithfulness. I know that, and we probably all know of small congregations that have imploded over bitter fights, who have not been able to find a way to get through them or past them. I know some congregations have endured abusive and toxic relationships for years, and they just keep stumbling along, wounding each other, never experiencing the liberating power of the gospel in their life together. But there are also congregations who know how to be in community with people, even with people with whom it is difficult to sustain relationship. They know how to include people that others would normally dismiss. I've found that rural churches also tend to be more aware of relationships with the broader community. Their borders are more porous. The church works in partnership with other groups and organizations. The currently popular buzzwords in church growth and renewal and redevelopment have to do with developing partnerships and networking with each other. The rule was you have to have 10 partnerships if you want to thrive as a congregation. You have to develop your network. But that's more easily said than done. Many churches know how to be that one-stop shop for all their religious needs. They know how to work on their own. And they may recognize the need to develop partnerships and networks if they're going to survive, but they may also not know how to do that. Small rural congregations have been working in partnerships for years. They tend more to be an organic part of the fabric of the community. And so those churches can tell us, the rest of us, what it takes to be part of the well-being of the community as a whole. I want to share with you the story of two rural congregations in southern Saskatchewan, whose mission and ministry is focused on enriching community life in the villages where they are located. It's the Alameda and Oxbow United Churches. Alameda is a small hamlet, really, of about 400 people. Oxbow has a population of around 1,200. They are a 2-point pastoral charge. They've received new ministry grants from the United Church of Canada Foundation, and with those grants, they've developed several initiatives whereby they deepen and enrich community life where they live. Anita Warner is going to tell their story in this video. Jackie Van Voort is the diaconal minister that is there, and she's their pastor. And she shows up in a few clips in the video, but Anita is a layperson in the congregation and tells most of the story. Jackie understands that her role is to curate the space for the people of the congregation to live into their ministries. And the result is a congregation that is participating in the new creation God is making in their community.
We had gotten one of the original grants at the Skyline Festival, where you were supposed to submit a video entry with your pitch for a grant. And that year, Alameda and Oxbow each submitted a grant request that then was approved. We got 2 grants. One was to do adult drama as kind of a fundraiser, but reaching into the community. And the other was to do Friday Night Fuel, which was a weekly meal at the church in Alameda. We had put good coffee makers as kind of a peripheral part of the grant, not thinking too much of it, and thinking we would do more to kind of poll the community in those times and see what people wanted from the church, knowing that the context of the church is really different now than it was, 10, 20, 30 years ago. But in the end, it was difficult to do that. We hit a lot of roadblocks in figuring out how we wanted to do that. In the meantime, we thought, you know what, why don't we try getting some coffee makers and see if we could have good coffee, because our community didn't have good coffee. We had to drive a long way to get decent coffee. So because we were people that like to have lattes and tea lattes and whatever, we thought, hey, if we want this, probably other people do too. It came about kind of as a chance thing, as I don't know, in my world, that's how God often works too, is by the chance or the things that you don't expect to turn into anything do. So over time, we arranged to buy the coffee makers, got trained in using them, and figured out how to use them. Well, we opened it as a cafe, 1 day a week in each community, and we started immediately with social media presenting the cafe, because all throughout our grant process, we knew that we wanted to use social media more and more, because if we were trying to reach younger people specifically, that would be the place to reach them. And more and more, though, older people are using Facebook. Instagram is more where we reach the younger people in general. So yeah, it happened to be my daughter, who was 16 at the time, that did the first set of posts, and eventually one of the baristas started doing the posts instead. But yeah, from the outset, it was announced as a cafe for the hours per week. We started with 2 hours a week in each place, and then we expanded to 3 hours, and then we expanded to more days. and then COVID hit and we shut for a while. Now we're back to one morning in each community plus an evening in Oxbow. And it's been interesting to see how those times evolved. And it really feels like more people are drawn to be there in the last few months. Like, it didn't happen overnight. For a while, people didn't know what it was, and they were surprised that it was there. And I think people had to start feeling comfortable being there, but they heard the coffee was good, or they heard that we have people come and bring baking to sell sometimes too, like kind of entrepreneurs come in with baking or donuts or whatever that they make themselves. Sometimes people are coming to access those things as well. So it's taken a while to build. It's not like a tomorrow thing, but I feel like there's a strong level of trust. Like, when I meet people in the community that happen to know that I have connection to it, they're always saying, "Oh, your church is doing such great things, and I really like what you're doing." So you hear a lot of people having respect for what we're doing and not feeling like something's being shoved down their throat. But it feels like a comforting, safe place to be, I think, which is what we wanted all along. But our plans are not what has come about necessarily, but it seems really good and solid. And I feel really proud of the communities and what we've done in that way. If you think of congregation more as Sunday morning versus the whole life of the church, it hasn't changed our Sunday mornings a great deal. But yeah, it definitely has changed, I think, how people see the church and see that being part of something feels good, especially in a pandemic, for example, that connection that we have. So one of our original grants, Friday Night Fuel, we still do the weekly Friday meals, which started in person only. And then during the pandemic, they became delivery for a while, and then delivery and in person and takeout. And that really, it has generated, it's not meant as an income generating thing, but in the last year it became an income generator because people felt good about coming to the church to get good quality homemade food. And they felt like they were contributing to the church, I think, a little bit by their donation. It's all by donation. More and more community groups or events have requested that the cafe be there, just because they want people to have access to good coffee or whatever. And kind of that, it's become kind of a perk of the community. Yeah. And again, people who are not United Church people feel comfortable asking for the cafe to be at various events in the community. Sometimes they're big events, sometimes they're small events. Like, it could be a swim meet, or it could be a drama production, or it could be the graduation ceremonies that were held outside, or things like that. There's a big local music event, a day-long music event with bands coming in, and cafe was very popular there. That's not by invitation, that's by our choice to go there, but we know that people really appreciate the cafe, and it's hard to know whether they see it as any sort of spiritual touchstone or whether it is simply good coffee. But you never know 3 years from now what people will take from that. So I guess we're planting coffee beans. I just love going into the cafe and listening to people talk, and listening to, like, sometimes seeing young mothers who have a place to meet, or older women who have a place to be that would be lonely in a given morning otherwise. Yeah, it gives kind of a highlight to some people's weeks, I think.
It's 2 towns, right? And 3 cafe times, and each one is different, right? Each town has a different kind of feel or response to the cafe. And I think that it certainly allows for a social opportunity that people might not otherwise have. And it does help to generate that sense of community for sure, but also, it gives people a place to say, hey, I'd like to sell my donuts today and, for next week, and gives people that little bit of opportunity to have that one more place. And so I think that impacts the community. And also each group that does that draws in a different group of people. And so in that way, it expands our community and our sense of community.
Well, something I've noted all through this process is that the people we think we're making the program for, whatever, ends up not to be those people. So for example, with Friday Night Fuel, we thought, oh, there's going to be parents with kids who are just had a tiring week and they don't want to have to cook on Friday, so maybe they'll come to Friday Night Fuel. Well, we were dead wrong on that. The people that came are older people who are really lonely, and it's hard to eat on your own, and especially you don't want to cook for yourself. And so who it ended up being a ministry to really is seniors and elders in our community. So that's all great. And again, like with our Thursday night cafes, we started that as the pandemic started, thinking the young people who weren't able to go away for school because the pandemic prevented them moving, they would come and meet each other on Thursday evenings and form some community there instead. Well, that's not who ended up turning up, actually. Thursday nights is for people who work during the day and can't come in the mornings, or it's for friends, like middle-aged friends that want to get together and yak at night. So I'm reminded again and again that God works in ways that we do not control. And that's good, actually, because then often better things come of that. Recently in a process, we're about to embark on a process of fairly deep change. Jackie's ministry may be extending beyond our two communities and into others. And as we make that transition, I feel like knowing that we've done the cafe and we've experimented with various things like Friday Night Fuel, that gives us the courage to know we can do this. We can move into new ways of being, and it's not going to kill us. It's going to actually bring us new life and new people. And they might not be people that come on Sunday mornings. But for example, we just had a walk on Truth and Reconciliation Day, and we didn't plan it for a long time. It was about 3 weeks ahead of it that we announced that we were going to have a walkathon and a meal after, and there was 50 people there and walking the 4-kilometer walk, and a lot of good comments from that as well. I don't know that we would have done that so easily 3 years ago, but people really now, and with the cafes, kind of it gives us some legitimacy in a way.
Yeah.
And I think people trust the other things that we're doing more, and we trust ourselves to do new things more, I think.
Thanks, Stephen, for showing that. So again, any feedback? What did you notice about their story? What that you might want to lift up and talk about in relationship to your own story? One thing I noticed was how couples, one is simple, what they were doing was. It wasn't a big, huge thing. They started small they had coffee makers, fancy coffee makers, and opened up the basement of their church and said, come have coffee a morning or two a week. And that was it.
Several comments coming in now. Reed says they saw a need and filled it. It's harder to discern what that need might look like in a crowded urban setting. Aaron says, I liked it. It was low pressure, no big goals, just about getting together, offering something really nice. God confounds expectations, says Ryan, while always being at work in us and others by the Spirit. I love, says Beth, how this story is about finding a need, one that the church people experienced too, that their community didn't have good coffee, and then rolling with that. Trusting in the Spirit, says Kevin. Kim says, I like what the speakers say about God working in ways we cannot control or imagine. And Bruce adds flexibility here. Ministry was not always what they'd expected, says Janet. Planning for young families and seniors were the ones who arrived. God blessed them with more than they had imagined. Lynn says, I serve a small rural church, and really any opportunity to get together works, and they bring others with them. It has to be okay to be casual. COVID has made it really tough, but the community of faith just figures it out when they're small. Reed really likes that they invested in equipment and training volunteers.
Another thing I noticed was that the timeline was long. It wasn't that we're going to hold a 6-week program and hopefully, we'll see what the results are. I mean, they're building relationships. And so they made their space available. They provided good quality coffee, and then let those relationships begin to percolate and begin to develop, and trust begin to develop, and, let people come to pay attention to what's going on in the church, but them also paying attention to what's going on in the community. And they're just a very slow pace. There's no pressure to get results. It is that we just want to make this community a better place for everybody to live in. That's one of the things I liked about it.
And Laurie just acknowledges that the seed money came from the wider church. Those grants are available, and what a good thing that is. Ryan's acknowledging that too.
Yes, and lots of times it doesn't have to be something big and huge. It can be a very simple thing. They needed coffee makers, and they got money for coffee makers. Good. How are people doing? I'm conscious that it's 4:30. Are people flagging, or do you have time for one more thought bubble of how rural churches have been in this land ahead of us?
You know what? Let's hear it, Christine. And if people are brain tired the way Ryan is, they can go back and pick it up from the recording later. It will be posted. So this is your kick at the can. I don't think you should stop early. We're having fun. Okay.
This one is a little more ragged than what I've said before, just because I'm still working on it. And so I'm just going to share with you the raggedness of where my thinking is going, and would welcome your input to it, your thinking through this as well. In the West, Christian churches everywhere are having to learn how to be the church on the margins. Years ago, Douglas John Hall, do people know Doug Hall's name? Have they read his work? Is a brilliant theologian and far better known in the States than he is in Canada. He's one of our own, and yet we have not recognized him and listened to him, I suspect, as much as we ought to have. Anyway, years ago, he wrote an article on the disestablishment of the church. And he talked about how the Christian church at one point in time was at the center of Christendom, and the culture and the church worked together and to create disciples, really. And people listened to us. I don't know if any of you were at the national office at a time when the politicians would call the national office and ask for their opinions on current social issues. What's the United Church think about this? And I don't know if that's happened for a very long time. Anyway, that's the experience of the disestablishment of the church. We often experience it as the painful loss of our privilege and our status and our power in the culture. However, Hall points out that the disestablishment of the church afforded churches new opportunities to speak to the culture in transformative ways. And rural churches, indigenous churches, immigrant churches, they've been living on the margins for years. They have figured out how to function without the external supports that the denominational and cultural supports that many city churches have been able to count on in order to do their ministry. So I wondered, okay, what does that mean? What does it look like to be the church, to be a church that embraces the fact that it's on the margins of the culture? On the Duke Faith and Leadership website, I came across an article by Cabin Rowe. He looks at the story of the church in the book of Acts, and he says, that we can find out from them what the church looks like when it's on the margins of power in a culture. He lists 6 patterns of those creative communities as they show up there. He said, first of all, the early Christian communities were remarkably interconnected with each other. Paul could write a letter to the Philippians and assume that it would get to the Philippians. When he was in Rome, he could assume it would get not only to the Philippians, but get to the other churches in the area. Somehow they had this remarkable network, this remarkable interconnection with each other. And they were engaged in active, frequent communication with and support for each other. And he says that was an important part of the reason why they spread so far across the Roman Empire. That communication system that they had. So a church on the margins needs to have some way in which to communicate with each other that flies beneath the radar, some other kind of communication system, but it's critically important. He says the churches in Acts were publicly visible in their communities. There wasn't this separation of this is religious and this is secular, this is spiritual, and this is the rest of your life. It was evident that the churches were actively engaged and involved in everyday life in their communities. They were publicly visible. They weren't just there to take care of their own, existed within the community as witnesses to something beyond themselves. They existed as witnesses to the work that God was doing to bring new life to weary and worn out social structures. So that's the second thing. The third characteristic, he said, was that, that they made provision for including those who were weak and vulnerable in their midst. This was not an outreach project of the church that the church took on. This inclusion of the weak and the vulnerable was an integral part of the very nature of those communities. Those who were weak and vulnerable, those who were excluded from the usual groups, were a fundamental part of the community. Fourth, they figured out how to process and incorporate disagreement and conflict into the life of the community. They figured out how not to let it tear them apart, how not to bury it, but disagreement, conflict, that's just part of what it means to be a community in relationship with other people. They figured out how to incorporate that within the life of the community. And he said, even regular members of the congregations were able to articulate why they existed, what the risen Christ was doing in their lives and compelled them to live, and why that compelled them to live the way they did. They were able to tell what kind of story they were in. And I think that's, I heard just a portion of Greg's workshop this morning, but that celebration time that his church has is, I'm celebrating God's, they knew how to incorporate suffering and brokenness into their life together. Now that's a very interesting list of what being the church on the margins looks like. It's very, very different than the categories of things we look for in what it means to be a healthy and a viable and thriving church. I just found that very compelling. In the article, he says, this isn't a prescription for how to regenerate your church. It is a description of what it looks like to live out of the story of God, the God who raised Jesus from the dead, having first raised Israel from slavery in Egypt, as Robert Jensen says. It signals where you look in order to see signs that the Spirit is being creative in your midst. Where is your church being driven into partnerships with other churches, with other groups, with other communities beyond your own? Follow that path. Where's the Spirit compelling you to make a public witness to the alternative script that is our story? Who's crossing your path? Who is wondering what's the difference that Jesus makes? Make that witness, even if it is at great cost or inconvenience to you. Where are you being offered opportunities to offer the radical hospitality of Christ to people whom the dominant script excludes? Then do that. Tell the stories of how that changes you and changes their lives as well and your life. Let those stories shape who you are as a community. There's going to be conflicts and disagreements in your communities, but the way you process them are part of your witness to a fractured and fractious world, that it is a witness that another way to live together is possible. So don't bury your conflicts. Figure out, what difference does it make that you are brothers and sisters in Christ? What difference does it make that you are part of one body? Then gather at the table together and receive the healing ministry of Jesus in your midst. Do the hard work of discerning who you are. Tell the stories of God's presence surprising you with new life when you thought you were abandoned, of God bringing new life when your life was shut down in despair. Those stories are present in your congregations, but we don't often give people opportunities to tell them. We need to do so because they mark for us the ways in which God's healing work is shaping our world. And when you tell them, they rekindle hope and energy among your people. Find ways to speak those stories into the lives of the people in your communities that are also feeling abandoned and forgotten by God. Tell them so compellingly that they become convinced that they too are beloved children of a gracious and a holy God. Finally, know that there will be suffering. That's just part of being human. It's part of the impact of systems that have been set up to exclude God and God's pattern for human community. Suffering is also part of the cost of following in Jesus' way. The powers that be do not give up easily. They don't give up without a fight. Living into God's regenerating creative work will bring opposition and resistance. And sometimes that opposition and resistance will be fierce. So ask, where is great courage being required of you? Treat the suffering you encounter sacramentally. Enter into the suffering that is in your midst. Bring the places where people are being blessed and broken and given to the world. bring them all together, then wait there for the risen Christ to show up, and then tell a story of what that is like. God's Spirit is beginning something new in our exhausted, weary, and broken world. Our congregations get to be a part of that. Indeed, we are being summoned to be a part of it. The Holy Spirit is setting us on our feet and saying, this is yours to do. So we best be about doing it. So,
Okay, so
yeah,
we have a few minutes for questions or responses, and I'm happy to see whatever comes up in the chat now. You're getting lots of appreciation both on the participants list and on the chat here. Christine, are there substantive comments or questions people have? Now's the time. You were reading from an article just a few minutes ago. David was wondering if you could just give us the reference.
yeah, so it's from Kevin Rowe. It's by, they've autocorrect has changed it to Kevin Rowe. It's Kavin, K-A-V-I-N, Rowe. And if you give me a second, I can probably find the actual name of the article. But go ahead with other questions then, and
Sure.
I'll look for that article's name.
Good, thank you. Other questions, comments, thoughts that are coming up?
I'd love to hear some pushback about the things I said at the last there, and just see where you're at with it, and what new questions you have then.
I was thinking
explore.
about all three of these stories and how much fun people had with it.
Mm.
I can't remember who it was. It might have been Ken Callahan who was saying that if it's not fun, it's not worth doing. That usually is a sign of the presence of God.
Can I just have a little
Sure.
comment? Hi, Christine. Thank you so much for your, again, another thought-provoking presentation. These stories are really wonderful, encouraging, positive stories. But I wonder too if in your work that you're doing, you can also find some rural ministry churches in rural areas who have like negative experience, or who are suffering some tremendous loss, or all kinds of stuff. It's not just the positive experience of the churches, but also the reality that is striking the small congregations.
And that's one of the things I was referencing when I said that some of these congregations are never going to grow. And they will, simply because they are in situations where there are the conditions for growing are just not present. And sometimes success for them will simply be holding on, simply be maintaining a witness to the gospel.
Oh, we're losing your internet, Christine. There must be people
And I
in
keep
your
thinking
neighborhood.
of this churches in Russia that
I think the teenagers are home from school, Christine, and we're losing your internet.
churches in Russia that were they were present until a time when the conditions changed, and they were able more people started coming again. I serve a small church that isn't going to grow, I don't suspect. I feel like we're Abraham and Sarah, and getting pretty old and thinking there will be no future. yeah, but you keep on making the witness and trusting that God knows what God's doing.
Thanks. I keep thinking about the synergies between the small rural churches that you're talking about and the small urban church that I serve. I mean, they're not the same, but there's an awful lot of comparisons between the two. And there are some things that are just about small churches, whether they're rural or urban.
Yes, yeah.
Eric Stephenson, I think, intended to write to everybody, but has just sent it to me, so I'll read it. He says, a mind shift is required for many of us into a kind of immanental spirituality. I think that means about immanence, whereby we act on the belief that God is in us right now to make a difference around us in the community. We look to God for direction and motivation and then act, and then listen for a response, discern what's happening, and then take the next step.
I think that, yes, it is a mindset shift that, and Alan Roxburgh, who I mentioned in the first lecture, says that one of the biggest mindset shifts we have to make in the church these days is from focusing on our agency and what we're doing and what we're able to accomplish, and focusing on God's agency, that God is active, and we often we don't acknowledge that, or we don't start from that space. We make our plans, we develop our strategies, we offer our programs, and then ask God to bless what we're doing, and think, if something's going to happen, it's up to us. And the mindset shift of saying, we're responding to the work the Spirit is already doing is a very big shift especially I think for United Church people. We are people who like to do. We like to do things. We like to live out our faith, and to be told, why don't you start with not doing, with listening, with paying attention, with noticing, and listening for God in unexpected places. That's a really hard shift for us to make.
So Bruce says, when you've seen that church is doing that, do you find that then the community starts to care for the church and even offer some financial support sometimes?
Well, one of the things that Alameda and Oxbow mentioned was that people do make donations just because they like what the church is doing as the church. And so, some people will come for the Friday night meal, and they'll make a donation of $50. Usually the donations are $5 or $10, but she says they feel like they're supporting the church. They're contributing to the church. They want what the church is doing to keep going. And I think a lot of churches have found when they opened up their worship services online that people who had no connection with the church began to contribute. They were always surprised by that. Is that what you meant, Bruce?
I think that's a helpful answer, whether it's what he meant or not. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That was what I was thinking about. And I often think that there's a story about a church in Saskatchewan where the 6 women left, closed it down. And the local business person came along and said, why are you closing? And they said, well, we don't have any money. He said, you never asked. And so I think there's a role for, and even in larger churches in the city, there are people who want to see you prosper and will look for ways to support you.
Yeah, I believe so. One of the experiments that a group of people did about listening to God and paying attention to where God was active and at work outside of the church building, the minister sat on the bench outside of the building every day for lunch and just paid attention to who was going by the church. She noticed some things that she hadn't realized before about the community, but what surprised her most was that people from the community would come and sit with her and start entering into conversation with her. And she was amazed at how many people said, that's my church, and considered that space, that building, that community, their church. They had never darkened the doors. She had never met them. She didn't, they, you know, but that was, they considered that that was their church, and they talked about the impact it had on their lives. So I think the community is there, watching what we're doing very often, but also we're having an impact that we don't realize.
I think that's a good place to draw it to a close. So thank you. There are more comments in the chat, and I'm sure we could jump into them, but I'm aware that it's about 3 minutes to 5 here in Ontario, and I need to tell you again about the connections for tonight. So let me draw it to a close there, with apologies to those of you who didn't get a chance to have your comments recognized. As I said yesterday, God reads the whole chat, whether we have time to or not. Christine, thank you. Thank you for your focus on being an intentional Christian community, and not being ashamed of that or pulling our punches, but living that out with focus and with excitement. Thank you for the fun that was there in the stories that you shared, and the sense of joy and the sense of enthusiasm from people who were rolling up their sleeves and getting their feet wet and just mucking in and having a good time with each other, and in the process making a difference to the people around them. That's a really exciting way to be church. And you've shared with us a vision that's, I think, important, not simply for the margins, but for the church generally. So appreciate your work and the ministry you've offered, and the stories that you were telling us about this. So thank you.
You're welcome. I'm wondering, could I close with a prayer that I came across yesterday evening by Diane Strickland, the United Church minister. Is that okay? Do we have time for that?
You do that, and then I'll remind people about our next session.
Okay, so this is a prayer, as I said, by Diane Strickland, United Church minister. She says, "It's been a strange time, God. I've lost track now of guidelines and rules. The online access to my vaccine record generates an error message. I've nothing to print and laminate. I'm forgetting to mask, not because I want to make a point, but because I'm 65 and just wearing down a little more each week. I don't go to worship because the risk still feels too high for me. But in making that choice, I also feel something's shifted inside. Worship seems like a long ago thing, but not just that. There's a feeling within that it is less about missing all the great stuff about live worship, which I do miss, and more about an unease about it being what you actually want. All those Bible passages where you challenge the worship your people offer because their living every day contradicts with what we proclaim. I feel urgency gathering there. All those stories have moved closer to my life and my sense of collective faith and ministry and witness. But how I love so much of who we've been together, how I miss singing our hymns and feeling opened up for all to know what that really makes me tick is you. Yet, this pause from all of it, this revealing how little my community felt the absence of our busyness and the impact of our closed doors. This is haunting me. Help us want to be your presence, so our communities and the world know that the power of your love at work is the promise of ours, the direction of justice is the path we will choose, and the humility of your incarnate presence in Jesus is the possibility for us to begin again. Something like that, O wondrous God of all that is and now and ever was. O Spirit who searched me out and whispered in my dreams. O Jesus who created a story of your purpose that I could be in and called me to it. Something like that? Yes, with you. Something like that. Amen.
Amen. Oh, I love prayers that are that honest. Thank you. So friends, we get a real break this time. If we were in Kingston, we'd invite you to a feast and to come and to sit down and to gather together and to digest each of the speakers we've had all day, as well as the meal. I hope you have a chance to do that anyway. I hope you've got something cooking on the stove and you'll have a chance to relax and ponder and maybe even connect with each other or with somebody else in your home, and that you'll come back in 2.5 hours ready to hear the next in Ellison's series. So thank you. Thanks for joining us, and have a good break. We'll see you soon.